Aries is the first sign of the zodiac, and its natural position is the first house. It thus opens the door to this series. It is a fire sign and initiates ideas and actions that originate in the head, the anatomical structure that, par excellence, is ruled by Aries. As one would expect, the first house also opens the door into the horoscope and is the home of Aries and of this sign's ruler, the planet Mercury. This is where things commence, start, begin, like the start of a race, the first day of the week, or the month, the year, and so on. But Aries is also the sign of epic and cosmic matters, and this takes us back to the very beginning of even the universe itself. In the beginning, some immense force created the heavens and the earth, out of which, through eons of the evolutionary process, man emerged with his refined anatomical figure. Aries rules the living physical body, but all the signs share in its anatomy. Aries also respects causes, those which lie behind beginnings, like the chromosomes and their genes, the genetic code as the origin and mechanism of human anatomy. Aries likes bold concepts such as evolution and the human types it produces. It will even want to detail special features like the brain and brain case. Indeed, Aries rules the central nervous system, the brain, and the spinal column, the prime initiator of movement and bodily function. The glyph of Aries can be clearly seen in this anatomical feature. Aries loves heraldry and historical arms, with all their richness and power, like the colours of the Black Prince, once the darling of the English people, and a previous life of Margaret Thatcher, and the more sombre crest of Cromwell, the darling of the parliamentarians. Aries is the sign of leadership, and it is often symbolized by the gently grazing sheep and by the shepherd leading his flocks to greener pastures. Aries stands for the cultural heritage and all that maintains it, especially first-rate institutions like the National Trust and its magazine. The home of Aries is the first house with its ancient history and myth. It usually features a spillover from its neighbor, the 12th house, which brings with it, for example, the miracles of the Old Testament. Tradition, respect, even reverence are often incorporated in the patriarchal figure. And in the Old Testament we have characters like Moses, Abraham, Isaac, and Zechariah. The myths of Aries include those legends that we all love, like Jason and the Golden Fleece, Perseus and the Gorgon, Apollo and his golden chariot, Hercules and his 12 labors, Bellerophon and Chimera, and King Midas, everything he touched turned to gold. Aries' ruling planet is Mercury, the mythological Roman figure, the messenger of the gods. The Greek counterpart of Mercury is, of course, Hermes, and the Egyptian Thoth, thus Thoth Hermes. In the military, Aries rules generals of various ranks, those who give out the orders that initiate action, rather than the common soldier who follows them. In battle today, the general is well back from the front line and concerned with documentation, political matters, and other first house affairs, rather than with front-line combat. Famous generals that come to mind are Eisenhower, Montgomery, General Patton, General MacArthur, the German Rommel, Pétain, the French general who was the victor of the Battle of Verdun and who became Marshal of France, and de Gaulle, who finally liberated Paris. Somewhat different to entrances, but also ruled by Aries, is the front door of any establishment. The front door of Harrods, the most fashionable department store in Europe. Then there's the front door of the BBC building, the Daily Express, Buckingham Palace, the Town Hall, the police station, the Tate Gallery, and the National Gallery. Aries thus rules entranceways, especially where these are part of the facade or front of the building. Hotel foyers, where areas of glass let in the light and people can see where they're going. Rotating entrances of glass at airports and supermarkets. They have to be spacious, but still keep in the air conditioning and keep out cold wintry drafts. Along with entrances, Aries rules openings, where there are gates, but also openings of festivals and pageants, galas, the Olympics, and even the state opening of Parliament. It was not so long ago that mankind, as national identities, fought each other like animals red in tooth and claw, and victory brought or lost sovereignty. Sovereignty conveys identity, and many nations like Italy and South Africa fought to establish unity first and then acted out their sovereignty. Unity, identity, sovereignty, power are keywords in Aries. They changed the borders on maps. They pushed out or withdrew the frontiers of nations, of republics, and of empires. Exploration often extended national frontiers as well, especially where there was far-sighted vision. Politically, imperialism drove the process relentlessly. Africa was a case in point. There was a scramble for Africa by colonial powers, but Britain, with powerful Aries qualities, predominated. The British partition of Africa from the north began with the occupation of Egypt in 1882, and Sudan, Kenya, and Uganda by 1898. From South Africa, Bechuanaland was taken in 1885, the two Rhodesias in 1890. The Transvaal and Free State won from the Boers in 1903, and Tanganyika taken from the Germans in 1918. This completed the imperial takeover of a huge corridor stretching from Cape to Cairo, an unparalleled expression of the sign of Aries. The British Empire continued to grow until a quarter of the earth was ruled by a single sovereign. Such expansion was achieved by empire builders like Cecil Rhodes, to whom monuments still stand in the South Africa of today. So much for the power of Aries and its first-rate qualities. But what of the sovereigns themselves? War enhanced their images. Royalty, however, is dealt with under the sign of Leo. A ray, other than that of power, that dominates Aries, both psychologically in individuals and at the national level too, is the seventh ray of ceremonial. We may laugh today at some features of ceremonial, but on many occasions strict ceremony and procedure has saved lives. Today, however, ceremony is more often maintained for the tourists, like the changing of the guards before the gates of Buckingham Palace. But even this, for some, may cause a tingle down the spine, as it taps into powerful national archetypes that remain patent for those with Aries qualities. In battle through the centuries, an inspired leader anchoring some powerful archetype could turn defeat into victory. When everything seemed lost, survivors, sometimes the remains of whole regiments, would rally around the colors, and helped by the bugler or the bagpipe, many an initiative had been regained and a battle finally won. The words of the poet Arthur Hugh Clough echo the encouragement of such a leader. Say not, the struggle naught availeth, the labour and the wounds are in vain. The enemy faints not nor faileth, and as things have been they remain. If hopes were dupes, fears may be liars. It may be in yon smoke concealed, your comrades chase even now the flyers, and, but for you, possess the field.
For while the tired waves, vainly breaking, seem here no painful inch to gain, far back, through creeks and inlets making, comes silent, flooding in the main. And not by eastern windows only, when daylight comes in the light. In front the sun climbs slow, how slowly, but westward, look, the land is bright.
Cromwell and Milton brought together two distinctive archetypes at a time when Britain had begun to clear away the corrupted atmosphere of an ill-conceived ideal which the country had loosely associated with the divine right of kings. to rule over all and sundry without the support of an elected parliament. John Milton, one of the leading poets of English literature, was a brilliant Latin scholar, and Cromwell needed his help through letter writing to quieten the minds of Europe's sovereigns and other important figures profoundly disturbed by, to put it very frankly, the execution of King Charles, instigated by Cromwell. Milton, a pathetic figure, going blind in old age, wrote the most outstanding epic in the language, using imagery and idiom that helped immeasurably to enrich English for its later role as the foremost world language. Aries rules superlatives, and without our usual recourse to the superlatives of much and many, Milton, in his epic Paradise Lost, stuns us with his cosmological descriptions of heaven and hell. He spake, and to confirm his words, out flew millions of flaming swords, drawn from the thighs of mighty cherubim. The sudden blaze far round illumined hell. Highly they raged against the highest, and fierce with grasped arms clashed on their sounding shields the din of war, hurling defiance towards the vault of heaven. The delight of this narrative is enhanced by identifying the epic course of man himself with the fall of the devil, for it is man who is the hero of the piece. Epic means heroic, classic, Homeric, historic on a grand scale, and these are found in Aries and its house, the first. Cromwell was the complementing opposite of Milton. He had that unnerving Aries feature in his nature, to go straight to the cause of a problem. He was a disillusioned man when he entered politics, disillusioned with the way England was being run. Cromwell quickly perceived that a vain and treasonable king was at the root of the country's problems, and he dispatched the king inexorably. Firstly, relentlessly wearing him down on the battlefield by creating his own army and defeating the royalists with it wherever he met them, and secondly, by ruling Parliament with an iron fist. His horoscope bears 3 planets in Aries by today's reckoning. The establishment of state sovereignty is not so removed from the identity crisis we all undergo as we pass from childhood and adolescence into adulthood. It is then that the powerful urges of Martian aggression and sexuality and Cancer's gnawing appetites begin to assert themselves, and the young search for identity. Socially at first, then at school and college, and eventually in finding the right vocation. The individual's sovereignty comes when he or she finds recognition in the community and is a respected name there. In all this, the nature of Aries helps to establish the person's identity. The spiritual identity is a very different matter for Aries. Aries has a keen sense of duty, the feeling that he must lead a flock, become a patriarchal figure in the community, perhaps leading them to the promised land, a director of industry, a member of parliament, self-opinionated, sometimes authoritarian, even dictatorial, to the extent of being repetitive, full of superlatives, and in danger of becoming the office or the club bore. Failure to develop an identity may lead to a personality crisis, especially when it comes in the first 30 years of life. A psychosis may even develop, and, of course, we are referring here to conditions like schizophrenia, in which the chemistry of the brain is known to be affected. Many people identify themselves with their occupations, so let's have a look at some Aries occupations through the houses of the horoscope. Aries in the first house is the national leader, the Prime Minister, or, in the United States of America, the President. When situated in the second house, Aries may represent the Chancellor of the Exchequer or the head of a shop, like Muhammad al-Fayed, the boss of Harrods. Aries in the third house is a leader in the field of education, the headmaster of a school, or perhaps a head prefect. Aries in the fourth house is the chief of the tribe, or alternatively, the head of the family, perhaps even the head chef. A fifth house Aries would signify a victor ludorum, the star of events, and of course Diana, the nation's favorite, and a cynosure of all eyes. Aries in the sixth house takes on a leading role in medicine as the senior doctor or matron of the hospital. Aries in the seventh house represents the peace delegate, police superintendent, the court-martial judge or magistrate. In the eighth house, Aries is the plan maker, like the draftsman or the city planner, or it could be the brain surgeon. Aries in the ninth house is the professor of biology, or perhaps the leader of the hunt. Aries in the 10th house is the business executive, the industrialist, the tycoon and entrepreneur, and even a Robert Maxwell. In the 11th house, Aries is the captain of a ship, an Air Force commander, or a group leader, or a friend in politics. And finally, Aries in the 12th house is the head of an institution, a prison warden, or the Pope, a religious figurehead or spiritual leader. History, in any shape or form, can interest Aries. Of Shakespeare's plays, the histories are typical, and especially where there is emphasis on the opening scenes, as in Richard III, where seduction of the victim's widow is begun in the first act by Richard himself.
Your bedchamber.
The historic television series I, Claudius is one of the most memorable in BBC annals, and is shown again and again, and repetition itself is an Aries characteristic. In fact, it is the ongoing Aryan stream of documentaries on British television, now as we enter the third millennium, that holds the attention of the avant-garde. History channels, wildlife, panorama, art, gardening, medicine, time watch, travelogues, royalty and special features. The list is unending, and these documentaries demand delving into masses of documents, archives, records. Aries rules the documents of everyday commerce, invoices, delivery notes, statements. Aries likes to command or participate in national and state projects like the genome, which is concerned with the genetic code held in the long DNA molecular chains of the human chromosome. Specifically, the project scientists are wanting to position each human gene or characteristic in its correct place on its own chromosome. The purpose of the Genome Project is to discover the gene sites of multifactorial inherited diseases. They would then be easier to eliminate with genetic engineering. Astrologically, this would place the planet Mars, the agent of engineering, in Aries, or the first house of genes, chromosomes, and heredity. Aries rules the name Mark. This is Mark Waite, our first-class printer, who has printed most of the English series of my books. This is Marcus, the technical director of these astrology videos. And Marco Polo, the famous explorer who set out from Venice and took the caravan routes to China. Aries is the sign of signatures, and his mark, which may be made by the illiterate instead. On your marks is the call made by the starter of the athlete's race, a very Aryan statement. Marking time is the marching on the spot which soldiers do when they wait the order to forward march. We often have to mark time, figuratively speaking, waiting for some journey to start, perhaps in the departure lounge of an airport, if you have an air sign like Libra or Aquarius on the ascendant. Marking somebody at soccer is usually an ongoing process for the whole of the match, and it's the best players who always have to be marked. The tick made on a document is usually the mark of consent. And in this test, the teacher counts up the marks out of 10. The Aries glyph mirrors the sport of this sign. It is that of skiing, and it is self-explanatory. The essential feature of the skier's art is that of decision-making. To be successful, the decisions taken on the skier's run must be clear-cut, immediate, and soundly based, and they contain the very elements of successful leadership, which are the dominant qualities of Aries. The same morphology applies to the dynamism of a fountain, with its faucets fully opened. The central thrust upwards of the fountain is likened to the spiritual forces taught by the yogi, which ascend through the central tract called Sushumna, so aptly expressed by the caduceus. The caduceus itself is an Aries symbol, but for its elements, the entwining snakes, to be Aries, they should always have a connection with mythology, with legend, or the physiology and anatomy of the central nervous system. The component of will is the skier's best friend, and the constant companion of the will is the human brain. Both come under Aries, and together re-emphasize the morphology of the same fathering glyph as we saw earlier. To complete the picture of volition, meaning from whence voluntary action emerges, we must state in Aries fashion that the whole of the central nervous system, as well as the head structures, have some connection at least with Aries. We should not be surprised that the helmet of ancient days and of proud militarism, and more recently that worn by industrialists, from workmen up to executives themselves, come under the planet Mercury, ruler of Aries. Helm in German means a head covering or helmet. Wilhelm associates the helmet with what it protects, that is, the seat of the will. Wilhelm is an Aries name. The tragic example of will in action was the Kaiser Wilhelm, who plunged mankind into the First World War. These factors suggest the element of fire that activates the nervous system, and Aries is a fire sign, something decided by ancient astrologers long before the era of Christ. Will is associated with a ray of will and power. Aries thus channels the first ray and the seventh ray of ceremonial order and magic equally. The first ray directs its power through the central nervous system, and the seventh bestows order, integration, and coordination with magical results. Finally, the first house is the house of consciousness, whereas the adjacent house, the 12th, is the home of the unconscious. The sign found on the cusp of the first house in a natal horoscope, the rising sign or ascendant, which can be any one of the 12 signs of the zodiac, depending on the time of birth, is the most important sign for that individual. It should be the sign which dictates the direction for that life, and through its symbols and archetypes we can be flooded with meaning and purpose. Before we close, I must re-emphasize that the sign of Aries is responsive to the element of fire, which it shares with Leo and Sagittarius. Aries is concerned with the fires of mind, split-second thinking, the instant decisions of leadership, the fiery head-butting tactics of confrontation, determined and sustaining will of the entrepreneur with unique ventures. When fire is successfully channeled into the head region, great men emerge from the ranks of humanity. Some men begin to pass their nature's bounds, and find new hopes and cares which fast supplant their proper joys and griefs. They grow too great for narrow creeds of right and wrong, which fade before the unmeasured thirst for good, while peace rises within them ever more and more. Such men are even now upon the earth, serene amid the half-formed creatures round.